by what we told each other in the time of obsessive re-examination that followed. The aftermath, an appropriate term for what happened in a field waiting for its early summer mowing. The aftermath, the second crop, the growth promoted by that first cut in May. I'm holding back, delaying the information. I'm lingering in the prior moment because it was a time when other outcomes were still possible. The convergence of 6 figures in a flat green space has a comforting geometry from the buzzard's perspective, the knowable limited plane of the snooker table. The initial conditions, the force and the direction of the force, define all the consequent pathways, all the angles of collision and return, and the glow of the overhead light bathes the field, the bays and all its moving bodies in reassuring clarity. I think that while we were still converging before we made contact, we were in a state of mathematical grace. I linger on our dispositions, the relative distances and the compass point, because as far as these occurrences were concerned, this was the last time I understood anything clearly at all. What were we running toward? I don't think any of us would ever know fully, but superficially the answer was a balloon. Not the nominal space that encloses a cartoon character's speech or thought, or, by analogy, the kind that's driven by mere hot air. It was an enormous balloon filled with helium, that elemental gas forged from hydrogen in the nuclear furnace of the stars, first step along the way in the generation of multiplicity and variety of matter in the universe, including ourselves and all our thoughts. We were running toward a catastrophe, which itself was a kind of furnace in whose heat identities and fates would buckle into new shapes. At the base of the balloon was a basket in which there was a boy, and by the basket, clinging to a rope, was a man in need of help. Even without the balloon, the day would have been marked for memory, though in the most pleasurable of ways, for this was a reunion after a separation of 6 weeks, the longest Clarissa and I had spent apart in our 7 years. On the way out to Heathrow, I had made a detour into Covent Garden and found a semi-legal place to park, near Carluccio's. I went in and put together a picnic, whose centrepiece was a great ball of mozzarella, which the assistant fished out of an earthenware vat with a wooden claw. I also bought black olives, mixed salad, and focaccia. Then I hurried up Longacre to Bertram Rota's to take delivery of Clarissa's birthday present. Apart from the flat and our car, it was the most expensive single item I had ever bought. The rarity of this little book seemed to give off a heat I could feel through the thick brown wrapping paper as I walked back up the street. 40 minutes later I was scanning the screens for arrival information. The Boston flight had only just landed, and I guessed I had a half-hour wait. If one ever wanted proof of Darwin's contention that the many expressions of emotion in humans are universal, genetically inscribed, then a few minutes by the arrivals gate in Heathrow's Terminal 4 should suffice. I saw the same joy, the same uncontrollable smile in the faces of a Nigerian earth mama, a thin-lipped Scottish granny, and a pale, correct Japanese businessman, as they wheeled their trolleys in and recognized a figure in the expectant crowd. Observing human variety can give pleasure, but so too can human sameness. I kept hearing the same sighing sound on a downward note, often breathed through a name as 2 people pressed forward to go into their embrace. Was it a major second or a minor third, or somewhere in between? Papa! Yolanta! Hobie! Nzii! There was also a rising note, crooned into the solemn, wary faces of babies by long-absent fathers or grandparents, cajoling, beseeching an immediate return of love. Hannah? Tommy? Let me in! The variety was in the private dramas. A father and a teenage son, Turkish perhaps, stood in a long, silent clinch, forgiving each other, or mourning a loss, oblivious to the baggage trolleys jamming around them. Identical twins, women in their 50s, greeted each other with clear distaste, just touching hands and kissing without making contact. A small American boy, hoisted onto the shoulders of a father he did not recognize, screamed to be put down, provoking a fit of temper in his tired mother. But mostly it was smiles and hugs, and in 35 minutes I experienced more than 50 theatrical happy endings, each one with the appearance of being slightly less well acted than the one before, until I began to feel emotionally exhausted and suspected that even the children were being insincere. I was just wondering how convincing I myself could be now in greeting Clarissa, when she tapped me on the shoulder, having missed me in the crowd and circled round. Immediately my detachment vanished, and I called out her name in tune with all the rest. Less than an hour later we were parked by a track that ran through beechwoods in the Chiltern Hills, near Christmas Common. While Clarissa changed her shoes, I loaded a backpack with our picnic. We set off down our path, arm in arm, still elated by our reunion. What was familiar about her, the size and feel of her hand, the warmth and tranquility in her voice, the Celt's pale skin and green eyes, was also novel, gleaming in an alien light, reminding me of our very first meetings and the months we spent falling in love. Or I imagined I was another man, my own sexual competitor, come to steal her from me. When I told her, she laughed and said I was the world's most complicated simpleton. And it was while we stopped to kiss and wondered aloud whether we should not have driven straight home to bed that we glimpsed through the fresh foliage the helium balloon drifting dreamily across the wooded valley to our west. Neither the man nor the boy was visible to us. I remember thinking, but not saying, that it was a precarious form of transport, when the wind rather than the pilot set the course. Then I thought that perhaps this was the very nature of its attraction, and instantly the idea went out of my mind. We went through College Wood toward Pishill, stopping to admire the new greenery on the beaches. Each leaf seemed to glow with an internal light. We talked about the purity of this colour, the beech leaf in spring, and how looking at it cleared the mind. As we walked into the wood, the wind began to get up and the branches creaked like rusted machinery. We knew this route well. This was surely the finest landscape within an hour of central London. I loved the pitch and roll of the fields and their scatterings of chalk and flint, and the paths that dipped across them to sink into the darkness of the beech stands, certain neglected, badly drained valleys where thick iridescent mosses covered the rotting tree trunks, and where you occasionally glimpsed a muntjac blundering through the undergrowth. For much of the time, as we walked westward, we were talking about Clarissa's research. John Keats dying in Rome in the house at the foot of the Spanish Steps, where he lodged with his friend Joseph Severn. Was it possible there were still 3 or 4 unpublished letters of Keats's in existence? Might one of them be addressed to Fanny Brawne? Clarissa had reason to think so, and had spent part of a sabbatical term travelling around Spain and Portugal, visiting houses known to Fanny Brawne and to Keats's sister Fanny. Now she was back from Boston, where she had been working in the Houghton Library at Harvard, trying to trace correspondence from Severn's remote family connections. Keats's last known letter was written almost 3 months before he died, to his old friend Charles Brown. It's rather stately in tone, and typical in throwing out, almost as parenthesis, a brilliant description of artistic creation. The knowledge of contrast, feeling for light and shade, all that information, primitive sense, necessary for a poem, are great enemies to the recovery of the stomach. It's the one with the famous farewell, so piercing in its reticence and courtesy. I can scarcely bid you good-bye, even in a letter. I always made an awkward bow. God bless you, John Keats. But all the biographies agree that Keats was in remission from tuberculosis when he wrote this letter, and remained so for a further 10 days. He visited the Villa Borghese and strolled down the Corso.